A lot of you are familiar with Hope House, but real briefly, our mission here is to prevent abuse and provide support to victims of domestic and sexual violence. And we provide services in 5 counties: Sauk, Columbia, Juneau, Marquette, and Adams counties. And that includes a 24/7 helpline, supportive counseling, support groups, advocacy, children's programming, community ed, and emergency shelter. So I welcome you to supporting families who have experienced trauma, which is part of our educational outreach in conjunction with faith leaders for healthy relationships. And I'm so excited to welcome Tracy here. Welcome, Tracy. Tracy's been with Harbor House in Appleton for over 16 years. And prior to her current role as the community education coordinator, Tracy was the children's advocate for over 9 years. In that role, she provided one-on-one advocacy with children and parents. Tracy's done outreach and co-facilitated many support groups, along with outreach at the Outagamie County Jail for girls aged 12 to 17 in secured detention. Tracy serves on a number of regional and state committees, including End Abuse Children's and Youth Committee, End Abuse Healthcare Committee, the Executive Steering Committee for the Outagamie County Crossover Youth Integration Project, and the Planning Committee for the Outagamie County Trauma Program. In her current position, along with presentations like what we'll see here today, she does healthcare trainings, law enforcement trainings, workforce violence, and violence within faith community trainings. And prior to joining Harbor House, I thought this was really interesting. Tracy was the head coach for the women's basketball and volleyball programs at UW-Fox Valley. Welcome, Tracy, and I'll turn the floor over to you, or the computer over to you.
All right, thank you. I didn't know that my past job was on there.
Yes, it was.
Yeah, we might have to update that a little bit. Well, first I just want to thank you for inviting me to come and speak today. I do this kind of presentation pretty much all over the state. Usually it's for end abuse, but then because of the end abuse presentations and trainings, I usually get other people that ask me to come, and I'm really excited. I love the fact that this is such a kind of multidisciplinary group of people. And so the one thing that I just want to say before I get going is to please ask questions, or if you have something to add. There's a whole lot more experience and expertise in this virtual room than me. And so stop me at any time and either raise your hand. I'm not sure how to do that, but I've seen people do it. Or just put it in the chat that you'd like to say something. I would rather have you speak. I can do it. I can speak for 4 hours or whatever if I have to. But I really, really, really prefer to have a dialogue. Sometimes the best parts of the presentations that I do are part of a conversation that we start in the group. So don't worry about interrupting me or stopping me. I would rather address it or discuss it at the time. Because I was a coach, I kind of once I move on, I've moved on, right? So so if you have something, then just stop me and we'll discuss it right away. So this this is a kind of a skimmed down version of a 16-hour training that I do for end abuse. And it started, and I want to give credit where it's due. It started, I went through about a year's worth of trauma training. And it originally dealt with, it was through actually UCLA, and Wisconsin and Outagamie County got a grant. And so they brought it here, and it was focused on displaced children. So like foster care and CPS and biological parents. And so what I found when I was sitting in those trainings was that I could connect with all of those people, because especially places like Hope House and Harbor House, our children are displaced also. And so, and then the more I got into it and I learned more with every group of people that went through it, I started to really connect and identify with a lot of the adults that we are dealing with. in our domestic violence programs and the shelter programs. And so I talked about it down at one of my committee meetings, and I told them that I was going to revamp it and focus it on our programming. And then now I've been doing it for about 6 years at the state level. So here I am. So if anybody has any questions for me first, I'll address them now. Otherwise, we'll kind of get going. We'll try to take a break I would say probably every 45 minutes to an hour, take at least 5 minutes just to let everybody stand up, check their phones, check their emails or whatever they need to do, and stretch. Otherwise, I find that I tend to lose people. So, are we good to go? All right. So I left this in here. This is one of the things that I put in when we're all in a big group and we're in the same room. And I think that it's important because of the fact that it is okay for us to disagree. Okay, we all come from our own place, our own history, right? And so we don't always have to agree. I agree to disagree with people all the time. Matter of fact, I did it with my executive director last night. So it's just one of those things. But the important thing is that we at the very least, respect each other's experiences. We don't have to agree, but we can at least show that respect, that we come from different places. And then take care of yourself. Again, if you need to get up, if you need to stand, if you need whatever you need to do, go ahead and do it. The other thing is that sometimes the stuff that we talk about triggers people. And that's the other thing. I want to make sure that you take care of yourself. If it gets too difficult, then please step away. You can contact Deb or Jess after. And of course, I am always available. And both Deb and Jess know how to get a hold of me. So, and you can ask me anything. So we'll go from there. So why is this kind of information important? It's really important for those of us that serve, right? That we're in a serving profession. Because whether we realize it or not, we're running into people who have dealt with trauma their whole life, or at some point in their life, all the time. Some people wear it, right, where we can kind of see it without them even being verbal, and some people don't. Some people hide it really well. But adults and children who live with chronic, like domestic violence or some kind of trauma, especially intimate partner trauma or family trauma, they live through. So when I say traumatic experiences, there's always been a huge debate, unfortunately, about children and whether or not they're directly affected, even if the abuse of behaviors are not directed at the child. If they're a witness, right? It absolutely does. And in many cases, from what I've learned, and when I was a children's advocate, I worked with over 2,500 children during my 10 years of being a children's advocate. And I can tell you that most of them would have rather had the abuse directed at them than to watch their parent be abused. So it is a very traumatic experience. They also bring their traumas with them everywhere they go, whether that's when they come into one of our programs, or whether it's the playground, or the classroom, or the church, right? Or wherever they are, they bring it with them. It's kind of like a very, very heavy suitcase, right? And trauma affects their behavior, right? A lot of times we look at it and we want to fix the behavior, but we have to pay more attention to why than the what. What they're doing is not the most important thing. Why they're doing it is the most important thing. And it affects how they feel, it affects their relationships, and honestly, it affects how they view the world, right? It affects how they think of you, regardless of what you are to them, okay? And then we know, and we are certainly learning more and more and more, that if we don't address these traumas, especially in childhood or right away, right? If there isn't some intervention, then we end up, the traumas follow them into adulthood, and we as service providers end up chasing them, usually either through the mental health or through criminal. And so, and then it's a lifetime of chasing, right? So the other reason, for any kind of service provider that this is important is because when we are trying to help someone, it affects us. And if we don't accept that, and we don't acknowledge how much this has an effect on us, we don't make it, right? And like I say when I'm speaking directly to domestic violence programs, we need to keep good people. We need to keep good advocates. But one of the problems we have is when we don't recognize the compassion fatigue or the secondary trauma, or when things there's so much discord in the staff because there's so many people that are so close to burnout, right? And then we lose really good people. And so it's really important that we recognize when we're starting to feel that secondary trauma and compassion fatigue. And then an understanding that it affects how we serve. Like when we're burned out, we don't have the focus, and we don't have the attention span, and we don't have the patience that we do when we're not at that point. And knowing what trauma affects, right? When we're dealing with families, trauma affects children and they react a certain way. Trauma affects parents, and then we have traumatized parents trying to parent traumatized children, and then us, because we have that secondary trauma, and it absolutely will disrupt our services. I'm not sure I can play this. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Brene Brown. She's awesome, by the way. And this is actually just I would try to do it, but I'm afraid I would just totally screw everything up. So I don't really want to do it. But if you want to go, you could just go to, after this, you can go to YouTube and pull up Brene Brown's Empathy versus Sympathy. And it's a cartoon, but it's like my favorite thing to help you really understand the difference between the two. And that sympathy does not really get us anywhere, right? Feeling sorry for people and trying to come up with reasons or excuses why, right? Or one of her things is saying at least, right? So they'll say, my marriage is kind of falling apart, and then she will say, like, well, somebody that has sympathy will say, well, at least you were married for 10 years. Instead of being empathetic, and by being empathetic, we need to try to put ourselves, connect something in ourselves so that we can connect with them. And so there's a big difference, and I really recommend, I'm sorry, I would play it honestly, but I have no idea if I'll ever get back to you at that point, because I am not a very technical person. So I will talk a little bit about just trauma, okay? So in trying to understand trauma, it literally threatens a person's life, physical integrity, or of someone they love, right? The life or integrity, physical integrity of their child, their parent, their sibling. It causes an overwhelming sense of terror, helplessness, and horror. And it produces intense physical effects. So when we're starting when our emotions overwhelm us, our body literally, like our brain sends out chemicals, and our body changes, and we get real tense and hot and kind of shaky and those sorts of things. And unfortunately, when we stay in that state, which I'll talk about a little bit later, that is literally how a lot of people transition into mental health, and many times severe mental health issues, is because our body is constantly on high alert for things. But I'll try to explain that a little bit later. So for us, trying to help people that we care about, or our clients, right, who have been through trauma, especially chronic trauma, oftentimes leave us feeling very frustrated, unappreciated, even angry, right? Because we're trying to help them. We come up with a good plan and they don't follow through. And then we get very upset with them for not following through, right? You put so much time in, and every time I go through this, I have one specific advocate from my past that just kind of shoves her way to the front of my mind. Because she was like this. She took everything very personally, right? And so she would get very emotional, but not always the good emotion, right? When she was working with clients and felt that she had did everything and they had a really good plan, and then they didn't follow through, and she would take it very personally and get upset. And again, when she did that, then her service would change, because from that point on, her attitude changed, right? So it's kind of like I tell my children, right? I have a son and a daughter, and regardless if it's athletics, or if it's school, or if it's friends, your attitude affects your effort, right? And so how we feel about something affects what we do. And so if we end up having a bad attitude about somebody because we think they haven't followed through with something, then it affects how we serve them. And then it affects how they feel, right? So we want to make sure that we kind of put this stuff in check and realize that it's okay to feel all of these things, but then you need to process through them with somebody as a service provider or as somebody in a helping profession. If you start feeling any of these things, which are valid, you need to go process with somebody so that it doesn't affect from that point on how you serve that person anymore. So hopefully that makes sense to everybody. Again, if it doesn't, please just let Deborah Jess know. So when I was going through my trainings, like I said, it was a national training, and there were 9 essential elements that they talked about for trying to inform and be really understanding of trauma, parenting, and providing services. And so it was either helping the parents, right? Either help the child or helping them just with their parenting and how they feel. So the first one is just recognize the impact of trauma. And I always try to have people pause a little bit, because it's really a bad idea for us to decide what trauma looks like for anybody, because trauma affects everybody differently. We need to help the person feel safe and connected, right? The one thing, I did a lot of research and other trainings at the year after I did that other stuff, and one of the experts that I connected really strongly with was Dr. Bruce Perry, and there's a lot of books and webinars and stuff like that. But he said that one of the most important things that people dealing with trauma need is it's basically it's the 3 C's, right? So they need to feel connected to something, because then they feel like they belong, and they're welcome, right? They need to feel cared for, right? Like they matter, how they feel matter. And those 2 things, feeling connected and cared for, help them feel capable. And a lot of times, especially like the kids that we deal with, sometimes that capable is just capable of being cared for, because they don't feel like they're worth it. So do a lot of the adults that we work with. Or it could be capable of great things, right? But that's what we need to establish with anybody. If you don't do anything else for somebody, those 3 things are probably the most important thing that we can do. Once we connect with them and help them feel capable, then it's a lot easier, because they'll help us help them. They won't fight us so much. And I just jumped ahead like probably 20 slides by talking about that, which I do that all the time. So we help them feel safe or settled. I'm also very careful about the word safe, because safe is relative. Safety means very different things to all of us. We help them understand and manage their overwhelming emotions. That's the first thing. And one of the reasons why I think these essential elements is so important is because this is how we help de-escalate people. This is how, if we pay attention to these things, then it won't work every time, but it will work some of the time to help de-escalate situations. So we want to help them try to understand and manage those overwhelming emotions. Help them identify their problem behaviors. So we're not going to ignore them, right? But we're not also going to shame them for them. We're just going to help them identify them. And then respect and support relationships in their life. And this specifically is about family discord, abusive relationships and marriages, and family violence. But one of the things that a lot of us who do domestic violence kind of omit is the fact that their partner is important to them, and their partner's family might be important to them. And so we need to make sure that we respect and support all the relationships, including the abusive one. If we don't, then we create a barrier to service. Number 6 is help them develop a strength-based understanding of their life story. This is also one that I think a lot of us who are in the service profession tend to overlook. And that is we focus on what went wrong, or we focus on the issue in front of us, or we talk about the history of the issue, if that makes sense. But we don't help them. We don't help them or empower them or feel strength about the good things in their life, the good things that were in their past. And so it's important for us to make sure that they feel there's some good in who they are and their past, right? And the things that they've done and the things that they've accomplished. I always tried to find, when I was working with kids, something that they were really good at. And then I would just like fill them up with it, right? And I remember I was working with this one kid, I think he was like 9, and I had a real hard time breaking through his defenses. And I asked him like what he was good at. And he just kind of looked down, he's like, nothing. And I'm like, come on. I'm like, everybody's good at something. And he looked at me and he goes, well, I'm good at sharpening pencils. And I'm like, okay, and I knew that he was testing me, right? And so I'm like, well, that's great. Everybody needs pencils. And so we ended up finishing. And then the next day I went down in our basement into our school supply school supplies, and I got like, I don't know, 100 pencils, whatever. The next day I showed up at school and I went into his room and I asked his teacher, I said, you know, he's really good at sharpening pencils. He got a big smile on his face. And I said, so if you could, here's a supply, and if you could have him do that, that would be great. That broke the ice with him and I, but it also broke the ice between him and his teacher. And it was a very simple thing. And I didn't do it because I knew it would work. But he actually, after that point, got really into art. But the fact is that there's more to us than what they're coming in to deal with us with. And it's important that we include that. We need to help the client become an advocate for themselves. Try to empower them. Try to help them find their voice. And understand that they're worth it. Right? They're worth fighting for, and they're worth speaking up. And then develop, it is important that we do develop trauma-focused programming. Although, again, I have a little issue with the programming part of it. I think it needs to be our services. We could have the absolute best programs ever, right? And I talk about this a lot when I'm doing trainings and presentations for other programs. We can have the best programs in the world, but unless we connect with our clients and help them feel cared for, right? They're not going to take part in our programs, right? If we help them feel connected and that they're welcomed and we want them there. So the example I give is this. And it's hard because I can't see hands, so I'm just gonna assume, right? Has anybody ever had a teacher from elementary, middle school, high school, college that made you feel absolutely loathe going into the classroom? Like, even if you liked the subject, that teacher like ruined it for you. Like, you didn't even want to go in the room, right? And then on the other side, have you ever had a teacher or a professor or whatever who made you love going in and learning in that classroom, right? Even if you didn't really like the subject, like you really got excited, they made you want to be in that room, right? The difference between those two teachers is connection, care, and capable. This teacher over here that you absolutely loathe going into cared about your grade and the curriculum, your performance. This teacher over here made you feel like they cared about you, right? They made you want and feel connected to what either them personally or what they were trying to teach. And they made you want to learn. That's trauma-informed services. That's the key to trauma-informed services. And then, of course, we need to take care of ourselves. And the best example for that is the oxygen mask. When we're going on a flight and they say, put your mask on first before you help anybody else. Take care of yourself first, right? We serve better and we can help people better when we are at our best. Any questions before we move on?
I think the only question, Tracy, was just if you would be able to make this PowerPoint available afterwards, that we could email it out to people.
Yeah, absolutely. You can have anything I have, you can have it.
Okay, thanks.
So these are the different types of trauma. So there's acute, chronic, complex, and neglect. So acute is one single event and it lasts for a limited amount of time. Okay. And we all experience that. That could be a divorce, right? Although that lasts a while. It could be getting hurt. It could be a 13-year-old breaking up with their first girlfriend, right? I mean, it can be that sort of thing. Chronic is that it happens you have multiple events over a long period of time. So that we're looking at, sexual abuse, right? Domestic violence. Complex is, it's a specific kind of chronic trauma. So you add the chronic in there. It happens multiple times and it starts at a young age. And it's caused by an adult caregiver. It does not have to be a biological parent, but it's someone that is some sort of caregiver to that person, to that child, right? So again, domestic violence, sexual abuse, and it spans, for years, and it happens all the time. And then neglect, which is just a failure to provide basic needs, right? When a child has to become completely dependent on themselves. So those are the kids that come to school with dirty clothes, don't come to school with food, right? Because they're basically taking care of themselves. They get themselves up. Again, they usually lack hygiene because they don't understand that it's important. And unfortunately, any of these opens the door to other traumatic events, and we become more vulnerable, especially when we're dealing with complex trauma. It absolutely makes us more vulnerable to other traumas. So some of the responses to trauma depend on certain things. For example, your age and your development stage during the trauma, your own temperament, right? The example I give with the temperament is my children, right? Because I have them at opposite ends of the spectrum, right? So my son, who's older, he's now almost 16. He has always been very quiet, shy, careful, very thoughtful, right? And then there's my daughter, who's almost 13, who is a bull in a china shop, right? She literally likes to be the center of attention, and she's needs to talk about everything more than I want to know about anything, right? And so when something's going on, my son will be like, Mom, can we talk? And he'll need to process through it. And my daughter, who I know is experiencing the exact same thing, will be like, what, there's a problem? I didn't know there was a problem, right? So their own personal temperament also has to do with their responses. Their perception of danger. And their perception of danger is going to be very different based on their age and development, their temperament, and also the complex trauma. Like, is it complex? Is it acute? Chronic, those sorts of things. And then their trauma history. Kids who are older experience a lot more. Kids who are younger do not. And then other adversities after the trauma, like, do they have a safe adult? Do they have someone in their life that helps them feel connected, cared for, and capable? Someone that they can count on. So the other thing that I focus on for this slide is when we are dealing with a family and there's 3 kids, okay? And they've all experienced the same thing, and we'll just say we have a 7, 10, and a 14-year-old. And the 14-year-old has just gone dark, just doesn't talk, real broody, doesn't want to be around anybody, and isn't doing well in school. And we have a 10-year-old, straight A student, right? Never causes problems, always wants to help, doing great. And then we have the 7-year-old who has horrible anger issues, getting sent home all the time from school, causing all sorts of problems, right? So we have 3 kids who have experience the exact same thing living in the same house, but each of them are very different. And unfortunately, the mistake that many of us make is we look at the 10-year-old and go, oh, she's doing great. And then we look at the other two and go, what is wrong with you? Because she's doing great. She experienced the same thing that everybody else did. So we compare and blame the other two because they're not like the one. But the reason for that are the things on this slide. You know, the 10-year-old maybe has a grandparent or a best friend's parent or a teacher at school, right? Maybe the 14-year-old has, you know, a buddy's family. So kind of on the fringe. And maybe the 7-year-old doesn't have anybody. So, any questions about that? All right. So, some of the things that we might see is that the person, and this also includes the adult and the children, might take on the abusive behaviors, right? It's a learned behavior, and that's how they learn to survive those bad moments. Not all of them, but that's how they can learn to survive those bad moments. They may try to recreate the crisis to gain a different outcome. And so this one took me a long time to connect with and to really understand. And I remember when it did, it was like an aha moment for me, because I was like, oh my goodness. And I thought of so many clients that I've worked with over the years who I would get so frustrated with. And I remember one in particular that I was working with, and it was a woman, and she moved here from a different state, and she came into shelter, and I was working with her kids, and so I was working with her because I always worked with the parent, right? And so she came in, and she left, I think it was Colorado, because she was raped when she was there, and she just couldn't be there anymore. So her and the kids moved here. And then I was working with her kids, and then her husband moved here. And it was a couple of years later, and she kind of just developed extreme mental health issues. And I remember about every probably 3 to 6 months, she would come back into shelter, and she would tell us that she was sexually assaulted. And I remember asking her, it's like, where are you meeting these men? And she's like, well, I meet them online. And I'm like, you can't, what are you doing? Right? It's like you're asking to be put in these really risky situations. And I got so frustrated with her. And then I got trained. And what I learned is that many times what trauma victims do is they try to recreate the trauma so that this time they'll have a better outcome, and then the pain will go away. So they always hope that this is the time, this one. And if they do end up having a better outcome, then everything will be better. They'll go back to the life they had before it happened, and their pain will be gone. So that changed how I served dramatically, and really helped me be much more compassionate, much more empathetic. And it just made me pause and just take a breath before reacting, because it makes sense to me now. So it is really important, especially when we're dealing with some of the women that we're dealing with. And we get real frustrated with them because they continually go and do what they do to put themselves, in harm or at risk. And then, of course, they might just get stuck on one particular moment or event, and they can't get past it. I remember I was working with a little boy. He was 6 years old, And I would sit with him and his mom for an hour, right? It was an hour an appointment. And he would go over the same part of what happened. He experienced his mom getting brutally beat, right? To the point where she was in a pool of her own blood. And this 6-year-old went and called the police. And then he sat with her until the police and the ambulance came. And he would tell me the same thing, to the point where mom would be like, Mason, you have to stop. And I would just very calmly say, you know what, mom, if you're having a hard time, which is fine, then you can step out. But Mason and I are going to sit here, and as many times as he needs me to hear it, I'm going to hear it. Because he was stuck on that particular moment or that particular part of what happened. So we learn by experiences. Even as infants, our brain develops by our experiences. Our brain develops based on how much we're touched and talked to and held, right? Or our brain develops based on not being touched or talked to or held. And unfortunately, our brain develops the more whether it's a bad event or experience or a good one, it develops more towards those. I'll talk about that again a little bit later. But an example, and the one again that I connected with the most, it was another aha moment for me, was the example that they gave was walking in the woods. Okay, so me and a friend are walking in the woods. We're out at one of the state parks, and we see a snake. And so, because I don't like them particularly, and I'm going to assume my friend doesn't either. And so our bodies will react, right? We'll go into that fight, flight, or freeze reaction, right? And we will decide what we're going to do. I'm going to assume I would run, right? I would flee, again, because I don't like them. And I would take my friend with me. So what happens, unfortunately, after that is that we can go walking in the woods again and be in like a similar environment, and we see something, and our body's going to react literally for us as though it's a snake, even though we might find out that it's a stick. But our bodies will still react as though it's that threat. So what happens is that when we're in a similar place or environment, our bodies go kind of on high alert for that possible threat. And so I connect that with a lot of the reactions that we get with people in shelter. Okay, we don't realize the threat, but something about their environment. And the example I often use is when I was working with teachers that would have my clients, right, my kids in their classrooms, or the teachers would get to know me, and then the next year they would call me because they had somebody else. And one of the teachers I was working with brought me in because there was a couple kids in her class that were just out of control, and like they'd have to clear the classroom out like every day. She's like, I don't know what to do. And I said, well, what happens? And she's like, nothing. And I'm like, okay, here's the thing. It could be anything. It could be your scent. It could be the way you look. It could be the way you approach. It could be the chaos in the room. It could be a siren 5 blocks away. There's so many things that can trigger a child's trauma reaction, right? Because they're on high alert for possible threat, that you think nothing happened, and that you've ever heard they just go off and nothing ever happened, right? There are reasons. It's just that and one of the things, I'll just finish this because I brought it up. It's kind of I call it a red folder. right? So what I worked out with teachers that I was working with personally was that the first thing we have to do is try to figure out what a good and bad day looks like, right? And we know walking in the door, right, what a good day for a child and what a bad day. Within about 10 minutes, we can figure it out because we can tell by their body language, by how settled or unsettled they are, by their facial expressions and, you know, flipping things and not being able to settle down and poking people. We know, right? And so that was the first thing we did was like, okay, what does a good day looking like walking through the door and what does a bad day look like? And then when we know it's the bad day and the child's really going to struggle, then we're going to immediately say, you know what, could you please take this folder down to this other teacher's room? And it's usually, you know, the EBD room, right, where kids go, but it's quieter, it's more one-on-one. The child can focus more because there's not as much chaos in the room. And I have no idea what that noise is. I apologize. And then everybody else in the room will be able to learn, and that child will be able to better learn in a quieter, calmer environment. And then we work them back, whether it's an hour or a day or a couple days, whatever that is, then we work them back into their classroom. And so I just start calling it the red folder thing. But the main thing is understanding, and it's the thing is that it never goes bad. The child never has to feel bad because of what happened, because we catch them before they are out of control, if that makes sense. It does not always work, but from my experience with the teachers I've worked with, it does work at least half the time, if not a little more than half the time. So if we can get them before they peak and they're out of control, then they don't get punished, and they don't have to feel bad, and they don't have to be embarrassed when they come back in the classroom, if that makes sense. So, but that's part of the reason why, is because they're always on that high alert. And especially with kids who deal with chronic or complex abuse, they're gonna try to make things happen before they actually happen because they just want to get it over with. So they create the chaos and they create the issues. So this just explains it a little bit more. And so if the brain is alerted to a possible threat, it releases chemicals that help the body, right, stay safe. That's our kind of emergency built-in system that we have in our body. And if the threat continues or it's repeated, like on a chronic level, then our systems stay on high alert. So that child that I was talking about that walks in the room and goes off and the teacher doesn't think anything happens, what happens with people, and this follows them into adulthood, is that most of us are calm and everything's okay. We go to a height of an emotion, but then we calm back down. People who deal with chronic complex trauma get stuck at 40, right? They get stuck right here. So it's like their accelerator gets stuck. And so their body is always on high alert, right? And it's just always waiting for that next threat or that next bad moment. And so they don't have far to go, right? So they do have a very quick response to the height of that emotion. And unfortunately, that's their normal, is never calming down, never feeling peace, never getting to pause. So trauma derails development. Okay, so exposure to trauma literally causes our brain to develop in ways that will help us survive. So we know that trauma changes brain development. Okay, and they're actually now doing scans, right? Studies and scans on brains kids and adults who've dealt with chronic and complex trauma and kids that haven't, or adults that haven't. And it literally shows that their brains develop in different ways and light up in different ways. So we're always on a constant alert for danger. And they have very quick reactions to any possible threats. And again, as service providers, it's important for us to understand that we may not recognize what is a threat to them. And so we think they're just causing problems, or they're just going off, or they don't care and they're being rude. But in fact, not always, but it may be that quick reaction to a possible threat, or their bodies are kicked in and they don't get to calm down. So safety and trauma, it's important, especially for those of us who work in like a shelter program, to understand that safety does not equal feeling safe, right? So even though, I plenty of advocates right here at Harbor House who literally feel that once somebody walks through our door, that their behavior should change because they have a safe place to be. I've had advocates literally think that because we give them a place to stay and food and everything, that they should be very well behaved. Like, which is like it's a power thing, right? You know, my old director always told me that we get from the community to give to the community. We don't get to save. People don't give us stuff so that we save it. They give it to us for us to give. And so in us having that attitude that, well, they should be happy and they should be satisfied because they get to live here for free and they get food and whatever, that then they should be happy. And there's a lot of entitlement in there, right? And it also creates a huge barrier to service if that's what we're thinking about people. So, but as far as the safety, we had a client that came in and I ended up doing the walk-in, and she came in and she's like, you know, I need shelter and this and that's going on. And she's like, and I need that middle room on the first floor. I need that middle room. And it was actually a meeting room, but we used it for when we didn't have any bedrooms left, we would turn it into a bedroom. And none of our rooms were on the first floor. So she had to have stayed with us before to know what that room was. And I said, well, I'm sorry. I said, but we don't have that room available. And she's like, no, she goes, it's the only place he won't get to me. So through a longer conversation, I found out that she was actually a sex trafficking victim. And she had been here before. And the last time she was with us, none of us knew that she was a sex trafficking victim. But she ended up staying in that area. And it didn't have any windows, and it was in the middle of our building, right? It was the size of a closet, but that was the only place she felt safe. It wasn't this huge building we have that's locked up like Fort Knox and you can't get in. She had to have that room. And it was very difficult, and I did get a little frustrated. But in the end, I moved the person who was in that room so that she could go into that room. So it's important for us to understand that safety means different things. Like I said, safety is very relative to each of us. Also understanding that a child's definition of safety is different than adults' version. And unfortunately, that can cause a lot of conflict between the child and the parent. Because the parent can be like, you know what, I got you here, everything's fine. Stop acting this way, even though for the child, mom's acting totally weird, completely different than she was at home and other places because now we're in shelter. And so they don't feel safe because it's different for them. The building means nothing it's just a sterile place, and it's not home, and it doesn't, you know, I always tell people that literally when a child comes into shelter, it attacks their senses, right? How we see, how we feel, what we smell, everything is weird and strange and scary. And as adults, and again, us as service providers, we must look through that child or that person's trauma lens. And here's the thing, and this is kind of tricky. We all have our own trauma lens, and we can't deny that we have it. But we have to try also looking through theirs. And the only way we can do that is connect with them, so that they can help us. So I think if it's all right, we'll take a break. So everybody can get a breath. Do you want to maybe 10 minutes? Does that sound okay? What? I'll let you two decide.
Yep, I think that sounds good. If we want to be back at 11:10.
That would be great.
Thanks.
Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back, Tracy. And I don't know about everyone else, but I am really, really enjoying this and getting a lot out of it. So in the next about 49 minutes, let's pack as much as we can. And as we said earlier, we will get the presentation, the recording, and the slides out to everyone after.
Okay. Are we good to go? All right. So, what a child or adult needs when they're dealing with trauma, again, like I said, I skip. I don't always pay attention to my slides, but we need to help them feel connected, cared for, and capable, right? So when we protect them from harm, whichever way that is, and it's really important for everyone to understand that protecting them from harm is being present with them. Just being that connection. It doesn't mean this big thing, or it doesn't necessarily even mean that they're brought in for shelter. It's that connection. You're being someone that they can count on, someone that they feel like you care, right? But when we do that for them, then they start to learn that the world can be a safe place. There are people out there who are safe for them. When we support, nurture, and respond to them, they learn that they are capable and that they deserve it, right? They deserve people helping. There's so many people out there who do not accept help, right? It's really hard for them. Like, they'll help other people, but they won't take help. And it's really important for us to compassionately try to help people understand that accepting help, all that does is allow them and empowers them to heal and then help others. That's all it is. It's just kind of paying it forward, right? And we all do that. And when we give them care, attention, and affection, like, I care about you, or I'm concerned, they learn that they're worth it. And we can do those things in very simple ways. Doesn't have to be grand gestures. Resiliency is strong relationships, again, feeling connected, nurturing abilities, allowing them to feel like they have some control. And that can be as simple as listening to them, right? Really hearing them, not kind of putting in what we think, but really hearing them. And having them feel like they have a sense of belonging. That's that connection. So again, some safety and trauma, right? Oh, I think I went the wrong way, sorry. Did I go the wrong way? Here. Okay, so adults and children who've been traumatized, they have very valid fears about their own safety. They have difficulty trusting anyone to protect them. And for kids, that includes their parents, or the non-abusive parent. And they have problems controlling their reactions to perceived threats. The example that resonated the most to me was when I was in the training, and the facilitator explained, she was a foster mom, and she had like 60 foster kids over like a 30-year period of time. And one of the foster children, I think she was like 12 years old, and she really struggled with her because she hoarded food. And so no matter what she did, she would, she'd go in every other day to clean, and she would find food under the bed and in the closets and in drawers and behind, the dressers, and it was awful. And she was really struggling with it to the point where she didn't know if she could keep her. And it just continued and continued, and they went to see a counselor, and they came up with some ideas, and she took her shopping. She let her pick out her own food. She gave her own cupboard with her name on it, right? She showed her all the time. She let her to eat whatever she wanted. And no matter what she did, she would continue to hoard food. And so she went into her background and found out that she was extremely neglected and went hungry all the time. And both her parents were really bad drug addicts. And so she was left alone a lot, and she was just, they never fed her. And so so she was talking to somebody, I think it was a friend of hers or something one time, and she goes, well, send her to bed with food. And and so she started making a peanut butter sandwich and a glass of milk. And so when she would go in to say goodnight, she'd put the peanut butter sandwich and the glass of milk on the nightstand, and then she would say goodnight. And she continued to hoard food, I think, for about another 6 or 8 months, but it got less and less and less, right? She never once ate the sandwich or drank the milk. But she did learn that when she woke up, it was still there. So it took a really long time. But again, that perceived trauma or threat is instilled when we are when we live in trauma, abuse, or neglect. So some of the reminders that they could have would be it keeps them in the state of an emotional upset. Others, those of us, right, might see it as overreacting and not understanding their behavior. And they sometimes will absolutely avoid everybody. Those of you that are on here that have worked in a shelter program, have you ever heard the phrase flying under the radar? Right? Those are those people that we think that just try to stay away from everybody so that we don't talk to them. And then they can just stay. I mean, that's what we think, right? And they have very isolating behaviors of their own. And there are so many things that we don't realize that can actually make them feel ashamed or afraid of just people's reactions. So what can we do? We can try to ensure their safety, or at least help them feel settled, right? Just stop, help them take a breath and focus on something. Well, one of our advocates is really good at grounding techniques. It really does help, right? Just help them feel something, or reorient them by look around and name things that they see, right? So it takes them out of the spinning. And then just to help them reassure, right? Find something that helps settle them. Activities or things or places, or I know Christy, my coworker, has really soft stones. And if they're going through a hard time, they go into our office to meet with her, and the first thing she does is pass them a bowl of stones. Help them define what happened, right? We need to try to respect and normalize the experience instead of, again, sometimes just the way we say things. Language is so important. Our language can, on the inside, feel shaming. And then if we need to help them differentiate between the past and the present, because they're reacting to the past, right? And so we need to kind of bring them into the present. So in dealing with difficult feelings and behaviors, we need to see below the surface. And this is one of the things I was talking about really early when we started. And that's, we need to pay attention to why and not what. Stop paying attention to what the behavior is and pause, take a breath, and wonder what could have possibly be happening, or what are they struggling with that could cause them to do this. It resets us as service providers to not overreact to their behavior and calmly want to know why or what's going on, right? The cognitive triangle, it's kind of goes off of this sort of thing, because when we feel certain things, we behave certain ways. And so all of these three things, our thoughts, our behaviors, and our feelings are all interconnected, and one rolls into like a domino into the next. So the example that they gave us was they had one person walk out of the room, they had two people come up front and start kind of talking, whispering, and then they had the other person, the third person, walk into the room, and then the two stopped talking right away and turned to the person, right? So I'll just give the example of like our front desk in our DV programs, right? So we're talking as coworkers, one of the clients walk up, we stop talking, right? So their thought is they're talking about me, right? They feel ashamed or guilty or angry, and then their behavior exhibits that. Then they get short or rude or with us. So all of these things are interconnected, and it's really important for us as service providers to understand that the things that they think automatically make them feel things. And again, if we learn by experiences, and the most of our experiences are not great, then our feelings and our behaviors are not going to be either. So again, this is kind of back to what I was talking about before. Our attitude affects our effort, and what we think affects our services. If we have, and please know that I'm not trying to be negative about anybody, because it's really hard to change the way we think. But that's what we have to do in order to serve trauma-informed. But when we have somebody that walks into shelter and we have advocates that are like, oh my God, that's like total just chronic homelessness, and we size them up before we've had a conversation because of the way they look, or whatever the case is, what we think affects our service. We don't give them the time we would give other people. We don't give them the attention we would give other people. We don't have the patience that we give other people because we've already sized them up. We need to really change that. We have to change sizing people up before they walk in or as they walk in the door. We need to have those longer conversations with people. We need to give them a moment. Even if it is chronic homelessness, we can still give them time. The one thing we can give them is some time, right? We can take a little time, well, not now because of COVID, but we can sit down with them and listen. Doesn't mean we got to offer shelter, right? Our shelter programs have to get away from the fact that shelter is the first option. Shelter should be the last option, right? Through our conversation, we could get there. But our programs are so much more than shelters. But we have to start understanding that. This is just kind of a response activity. I was at a training and the guy was explaining this, and it was something, it was basically based on a police and a person's response and how their how the police's reaction is. And I listened to about, I don't know, 20 seconds of it, and I just started writing everything down because I took it and kind of revamped it based on trauma, right? And so what this is helping us understand that there are certain possible emotional reactions that we have to situations. The example I gave, and that I give when I'm talking in these kind of trainings, is for DV programs, is a client that's in shelter sitting outside in a vehicle with their abusive partner, right? And so if we look outside and we've worked with this person and we've safety planned and we're really worried, and also we look outside and they're sitting with their abusive partner in a vehicle, what are some emotional reactions that we have to that? Because we have them, right? And then go a little bit further and think, what are some possible trained responses that we have? And you know where we go? Right to the rules, right? We go right to the rules, which we should not, but we do. And then I want to push everybody a little bit farther because I want you to think of what are some possibly trauma-informed responses that we could have. And then even taking it a step farther and thinking about what are some possible program prevention options. And that means changing people from going right to the rules and interacting with the person. And my answer to that situation is, I will say, why are you so upset that the person's out in the car? And the advocate will say, well, because of safety. And my answer to that is, whose? Yours? No, the client's. But then again, how do you know that the client sitting in that vehicle with her partner or his partner isn't feeling the most safe that he or she has felt since they walked through our door? Because they can read their body language, their facial expressions, their tones. They're not looking behind their back. They're actually being able to find out what's in that person's head. Safety is relative. So as caregivers and service providers, we sometimes fall into focusing too much on our programming. Again, I talked about that, right? And how to fix a situation. I want to make this as clear as I possibly can. Domestic violence is not something we can fix for other people. Our jobs are to surround people with support and services, not to try to fix the situation. We can't. And we shouldn't try to fix a situation for someone else. We need to become more relationship focused instead of program focused. Like I said, we can have the best programs in the world, but until we make that connection and help them feel connected and cared for, they don't care about our programs. So this is something, again, that I learned from Dr. Bruce Perry, and that's just the trying to help people, again, de-escalate a little bit, and that is to help them relate, which is that relationship, right? Help them feel connected and comfortable where they're at. And then that's when the reasoning can start. Once we take care of those things, then the client is more capable to concentrate and problem solve. And then we're not caught kind of doing everything for them, which creates a barrier. So the other thing is we tend to go into two different places, which is we start where, we go in kind of with the clipboard and the paperwork, and we sit down and say, tell me what brought you here today, right? But we're real calm and everything is, right? We're in this very reasoning zone where the client is walking in a survival zone, which is very different from a reasoning zone. But we focus right away on why they're here instead of connecting, right? Instead of helping them feel like we care about how they feel and what's going on, right? Or we escalate with them. And this happens a lot with people who are staying in shelter, right? They come at us and they're all really mad or upset about something. We're calm, but then we become alert, alarmed, and then we just escalate right with them. And that doesn't help anybody. So this is just kind of a chart to help people understand the difference between the mental state and the reasoning that happens as we escalate, or as somebody who's dealt with trauma escalates, and kind of what happens to our type of thinking as we escalate into it. And we go from literally a reasoning zone where we can concentrate, retain, and perform information to survival zone, which is we can't concentrate, retain, and perform anything. There are studies now showing that when we are in a trauma, it actually lowers our IQ, not our intelligence level, but during those moments, we are not able, right? Our bodies and our brains are not able to concentrate, retain, and perform information because it doesn't work that way. It's totally this explains it right here, this next. So what happens, and this is, I explain it based on a kid sitting in a classroom. So he comes in or she comes in and everything's great and they're calm. Their thinking is very reflective and they're able to concentrate, retain, and perform. And then they hear something out in the hallway. They hear a noise out in the hallway. And then they become alert, right? Now, this is, again, a child who's dealt with complex trauma. Then what happens to their thinking is it becomes very concrete. They can either listen to the teacher or they can pay attention to the possible danger. And the possible threat is going to win. So they're no longer listening to the teacher, right? So they need to identify which causes them to lose focus. Then they're going to hear some voices. And then they become alarmed. And their type of thinking becomes emotional. And this is where their feelings actually begin to overwhelm them. And they get very scared. And then they hear some people walking or whatever, just some other stuff going on, or people talking. And then they become fearful. And then their way of thinking is reactive. And this is when they start to become disruptive. They can't sit still. They start making noises, start poking people, right? Whatever the case is. They can't sit still anymore because of the possible danger or threat that's happening out there. And then, I don't know, they hear louder voices or lock or slam or whatever the case is, and then it actually becomes a state of terror for them. Their type of thinking then becomes reflective, or their reflex kicks in, and that is when their survival thoughts and actions take over. And a lot of times, especially kids and people who dealt with complex trauma, this is where they start getting in a lot of trouble, right? They start throwing things, and because they're going to create that crisis because they know it's coming anyway. And this is where they're throwing chairs and really disruptive, and the class gets cleared out, and they get sent to the principal's office once they are done, and then they call home. And by the time they get home, they're in trouble. And the main reason probably why this all happened is because something the night before at home caused their body to react this way. So, research has shown that people, especially children who are stressed and anxious, struggle to use parts of their brain that allows them for rational and reasoning and thinking. So we need to change our approaches and our views to things, kind of going from, attention, they're just attention-seeking behaviors, they're just trying to get attention, to connection, right? They're not trying to get attention, they're actually trying to get somebody to connect with them. They need somebody to connect with them. And it's not trouble, like seeking behaviors are not trying to cause trouble, they're trying to bond, right? They need to feel like they matter. And instead of what's wrong with that person, what has happened to them? And it's really important if we're actually going to become, and have trauma-informed services, we need to switch this type of thinking. So I'll talk a little bit about the ACEs. I won't spend a lot of time on it because I know a lot of people know enough about it, but it was a study that was done years ago. I think it was like 17,500 people. And what it showed was there was a connection between adverse childhood experiences, which are childhood traumas, and high scores that directly affect many of the social and physical risk factors as people get older. These are the most common ones, and there were 10. 5 of them were happened directly to the child or the person, and 5 happened within the home of the person, so somebody in the household. And of these 10, I always tell people that I can connect 9 to domestic violence, right? Because we know AODA issues, that's a coping skill, that's a coping method, right? Drugs and alcohol get people through the day when they're dealing with isolation and chronic abuse. Separation, divorce, issues with the parents, mental health, right? Domestic violence and criminal behavior, which means, you can get arrested once for domestic violence, and that's considered an ACE, or one of your parents can. And then we have emotional and physical neglect, which is not getting your needs met. That absolutely happens. And then we have emotional and physical abuse. The only one not directly connected is sexual abuse. So this is the pyramid, right? So we have the adverse childhood experiences, we have the childhood trauma that happens, or especially if it's chronic or complex, it continues to happen. We know now that it literally disrupts brain development. And then, months or years of that, and then we go into having social, emotional, and cognitive impairment. That's school age kids, right? Those are those kids, seriously, that nobody wants to play with, nobody wants to sit with, nobody wants to eat lunch with, nobody wants to partner with. Teachers don't want them in the classroom. Those are the kids we work with. And the reason they're that way, 9 chances out of 10, probably 9.5 out of 10, is because of childhood traumas. Then years of that and feeling like they're not, nobody likes them and they're just trouble. Then they start taking on really risky behaviors, right? Years of that turn into disease, disability, and social problems, and literally disease to our bodies. It's not just mental health issues. It causes physical health issues. And then it led to early death. So of the ones that had, they focused on having 4 or more. So you're at a higher risk for that pyramid if you had 4 or more, a lower risk if you had 3 or less. So what it showed for the people that had 4 or more is that over 60% had somebody arrested, in jail, in prison. Over 60% had domestic violence. 60% or almost 60% of the kids were physically abused. Over 50%, again, were sexually abused. Over 50 had someone in the household with mental health issues, and so on. What they've also found is that among adjudicated youth with high A scores, 85% of them were first suspended from school in the 2nd grade. Now, I worked for about 6 or 7 years at our jail, and I worked with girls between the ages of 12 and 17 who are in lockup. And I will tell you that I kept all the paperwork and the stuff that I did, and this is true. With the complex traumas, it usually started around the 2nd grade. And the other thing that I found is that with people who didn't have the complex traumas but had the traumas happen later, it was usually 12 to 24 months after the trauma, or 12 to 18 months after the trauma, that they started acting up, which caused a lot of problems for them because nobody understood why they were acting up, because the trauma was long past. So the reason, though, is because they don't feel safe at home and they don't feel welcomed at school. So there's no safe space for them or safe people. This is my favorite slide. Because what it shows is, of those people that had high A scores, it shows that if they had one safe person, right, one healthy, safe person, adult in their life, it took their risk factor for that pyramid from almost 40 down to 50. One person, right? One aunt or uncle, one grandparent, one teacher, one coach, one family, parents of a family or a friend. One person that helped them feel connected, cared for, and capable. And it took such a drastic difference in the risk factor for that pyramid. And I know that our domestic violence programs are that one person for, I can't even put a number on it. Because that's what we do. We become that one place and that one person that helps them feel those things. So again, I won't go through all of this, but the trauma-informed program needs to be a relationship-focused program. We have to change that. Again, our programs are great, but we have to build those relationships first. You know, one of the things that I learned early on at Harbor House is that our community relationships were one of the most important things that we had. And what I understand now, you know, over 16 years later, is when it comes to our services, the relationships, the better connections we have with people, the better we serve. So we cannot just be satisfied with just being informed. And that's one of the issues that I have. Watching a webinar, it's great, it's very educational, but it's not a training. And the other thing is that we also have to, sorry, I'm not sure how that happened, but I have a misprint there. But we have to develop a trauma-infused service. You have to take the stuff that you learn and implant them into your services. And not just be informed. That's not good enough. The other thing is to make sure that we get to know our community resources. Don't make a list. Build a relationship. You know, I train a lot of nursing students all over. All the nursing students at UW Oshkosh, all the nursing students at the Tech, all spend 2 to 3 hours with me. And one of the most important things that I make them do is understand, first make a list, but then they need a goal of going out and actually visiting these places. So you want to make sure, regardless of who you are, if you're a faith community or a business or a different kind of agency, get to know the partners and your resources in your community. Because when it comes to being able to refer someone, how you translate that depends on whether or not they're going to take it. You hand them a brochure and say, here, we have this. It's going in the garbage, probably 90% of the time. But if you tell them that you've been there and that you've met them and you can explain it and you'll help them make the phone call, complete difference on how many people are going to actually let that happen and at least connect one time. Completely different from those that we just like, well, you know, we have this, right? So I always challenge people to get to know your local agencies. That's all I got. Does anybody have any questions?
You're also welcome to unmute yourself if you don't want to type something out in the chat, or if there's any scenarios you can think of, that any experiences with families that you want to run by Tracy.
Or not. I know it's a lot. It's a lot to take in a short period of time. And I'm available. You know you have my contact information if anybody wants to get a hold of this. I will send this to you as soon as we're done so that you can give it to whoever wants it.
Great.
So hopefully this is what everybody was looking for, or at least what you guys were looking for.
Thank you. Very well done. Appreciate it.
Thank you. And then I think you have something evaluation, yes, or whatever it was.
Yeah, so if people don't have any questions, you know, and we're ending a little early, so I'd highly encourage you to click on the link in the chat. It's just a brief survey so that we can get some feedback about how this went for you, and if you'd like to see similar trainings in the future, what that might look like for you. But otherwise, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to Tracy.
Great, thanks everyone, and please do fill out the evaluation for us. It's very helpful. Thanks, Tracy.
You bet.